Welcome, everybody, for another Hire Me series. We have Bryan Greene from Dental Mastery Dynamics. Welcome. I'm super excited because we worked together at a past DSO, and you actually hired me. So this is interesting. I don't particularly remember what that process felt like, but with your experience, as you know, any DSO has a hierarchy, they have a standard, they have a whole bunch of people that go through a process. And I want us to talk about we'll first talk about your business. What do you do, your background, and then we'll dive into the actual hiring platform and what that looks like.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's very funny. I do vaguely remember when I hired you. It was a long time ago. Not that long ago. We're both very young for the listener. No, but in reality, I do remember vaguely, a little different than I think what the audience here is looking for, because I know you were a clinician at the time, but I still think that in that kind of environment, and we're going to talk about this later as we go, but it's just as much about trying to impress the candidate as an interviewer as it is trying to be an interviewee and the pressure. So we'll start out that way. I'll talk a little more about DMD in a second, but I always love saying that it's just kind of like what they always say about any wild animal. We're both in Florida, and everyone says, like, all the scary animals everyone's scared of in Florida, and they say, oh, don't worry, they're more scared of you than you are of them. Guess what? That still applies in interviews. They have just as much to fear of you as you do of them when you're being interviewed. They want to impress you just as much as you want to impress them. But So Dental Mastery Dynamics, DMD, as Maria pointed out, I started out in operations at a big DSO. I grew my way up. I started at the front desk, ended up running over my career 100 practices, which was about 10% of the entire organization over the time frame of my career. And from there, I joined a small group, a private practice group that I was trying to help expand in the DSO space. And I realized, and I'm sure this will relate to a lot of listeners, that when you're in the DSO space, I used to joke around as a director and as a VP, if you're sitting under $200,000 a month, I had a corrective action plan. I had a 30, 60, 90. I was figuring out what's broken in this office and how I got to fix it. But if I'm talking to anybody listening from a private practice, you know that if your office hits $100,000 in a month in revenue, your dentist is taking the team out for Outback. Like, it's time to celebrate. One round minimum, maximum. He's not going to pay any more than that. But at the end of the day, he's like, that's a big deal in a private practice. And I started thinking, well, what is the difference, right? And how are these two groups so vastly different in what they view success as? And what I realized was the value that the DSO space brings to the dental industry is that dentists who never went to business classes, never went to business school, they can run a practice and they can just worry about dentistry and let the DSO handle the rest. Versus private practice, the dentist is managing the business, and they're managing all the side of things as far as how to run things and keep the doors open, as well as the clinical side. And a lot of dentists really try to find this consultant path. The problem, if you've worked with consultants in the past, is there's a very high cost factor when it comes to consultants. I remember I worked with a group that the owner shut down all of his practices, all 17 practices, for 3 working days, and paid for hotels for all of his team members to come, and paid a consultant $25,000 to coach for 3 days. And I'm thinking to myself, how could a private practice owner ever afford something like this? So what I did was I ended up trying to bridge the gap. So I built DMD, which is an AI coaching platform. So it takes AI, like how we've seen across the industry that's blowing up all over the place, but I take it in a very different direction. What I did was I coded my working knowledge and my business partner's working knowledge into an AI that creates a metrics page, but then tells the office, what do these numbers actually mean? What behaviors do you have to do to fix it? And then it'll follow up with you. It'll remember your team members. It'll make sure it knows people's names, people's roles, and we'll follow up and say, hey, we told Kim in the front desk to do this moving forward last week, and I'm not seeing the results change. How has this been going? So essentially, it creates a virtual consultant, a virtual director of operations that can run these things for a practice and be that resource. But because it's an AI base instead of an actual person whose salary I have to pay, it can be provided to offices for the same price point as an AI product versus hiring a 6-figure business expert with an MBA to run your practice for you when you can barely keep the doors open right now with your profit margins.
I love your product because one, I get so many AI companies reaching out to me, and I'll entertain some of them because of lack of time. And it's usually the same type of like AI software, right? So, okay, like how is yours different, right? Yours is completely different. I have yet to I have yet to find another company that's doing anything remotely the same. One. Number two, you know that even when you weren't my manager and you weren't even in my region anymore, I would always reach out to you because at least in the DSO that I was working at the moment, I was getting paid hourly plus mission. And they had a pretty good type of system there. And I knew if I knew how to read everything properly and really dive into the numbers, I could really monetize by doing the right thing. It's just understanding what those metrics mean, which I past like, Profi SRP ratio, like past that, I didn't really know what it all meant. And I always reached out to you because I knew that you had a way to how to explain it. I understood it really well. And I always did so much better because of the way you explained it. So having an AI tool that basically does like what your brain like told it to do, I would be so excited to have something like
Yeah.
that. I would have absolutely loved it. So that's
Yeah.
awesome.
Well, and to your point, there's lots of products out there. First of all, I laugh when you talk about the AI solutions, and I know you work with all these different AI solutions, but if you've ever gone to a dental conference and you go to these places and you look at every other booth at this point, looks like it's the same people selling just a different like picture on behind them, but it's the exact same thing. And really, when I think of AI in dentistry right now, there's two major solutions it's handling, and it's handling very well, but there's about 2,000 different vendors doing different versions of it. And it is AI receptionists, and it is case planning as far as like x-ray reading, and maybe virtually you can add scribes in there too, but scribe is more translation and transcription versus actual AI involvement there. So
Yeah.
that's where I wanted to do something very different, because that's the side that dentists still need the most help with. Dentists, I mean, hopefully they understand how to read an x-ray. If not, then maybe we got to figure out where we're in dental school. After that, there's so much more that needs to be looked at that they just never went to school for. They never learned. And there needs to be something to bridge the gap there. So that's where I came out with this. And that's why I wanted to figure out how I can help practices and really democratize things. Because the idea was, when I think about it, the reason why DSOs get this kind of support is because, I made great money. Like you were talking about with your commission at this DSO, I made great money. I was in, a high six-figure salary. It was great.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it was split between 29 to 35 practices. So no single practice had to pay a whole lot for that support. When you talk about one office trying to hire somebody with that kind of experience, it becomes insurmountable. And that's where you get to that. And one thing to your point too that I love talking about as well is it's how you portray the information. There are also solutions out there right now. I'm not going to make any names or anything, but there's lots of companies, or at least a couple big ones, that run the same kind of metrics as a DSO, where they can give you numbers about anything and everything you could possibly imagine. If I wanted to know how many teeth shade A3 and this shape were delivered last 6 months, I'm sure I could find a metric for it in most of these platforms. But how does that actually impact the business? It's just like if you went to a team and you told your team, hey, your acceptance was 55% last week. Well, are they going to really care? The front might, the manager might, and anybody who's incentivized off of acceptance might care. Everyone else, your dental assistants, your hygienists, if they're not paid that way, any of your clinicians that aren't that way, you say percentage and you say the word percent, and this is all you got. You got nothing left. It's blank faces, blank stares. They don't care. It's about how you convey the story, how you turn the numbers into the story behind the numbers. One of my favorite phrases I came up with years ago is, the metrics should always tell a story, but they should never be the story. And when you focus too hard on the number and the number becomes the behavior versus the number tells you what behavior to impact, that changes and you're chasing the rabbit the whole way.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's dive into the interview process. And I'm so excited about this because of your DSO background and how many people you've interviewed in the past. How is it different than a startup?
Well, so your point earlier, the DSO usually has a very well-defined process. There's going to be 2 or 3 interviews. Like when we interviewed you forever ago as a hygienist, you had to go to potentially the office manager and the owner first to make sure they like the culture fit and the personality fit. Then you'd meet with me as the regional at the time, and I would go through and make sure that I could ask you the questions as far as the actual business side, not necessarily business, but driving the process. And then you meet with our hygiene manager and they would make sure clinically you were sound and go from there. So there was a very defined process. In the startup industry or the startup side of things, it's very different in that usually there's one person, maybe two, if it's kind of a more advanced startup, that's going to be talking with you. And you're almost always going to be interviewing with the founder, with the CEO. And I would say, and I know you haven't asked quite yet, but I think one of the biggest things I talk about as a difference is people get very scared of titles. Like if I was interviewing for a big DSO and I interviewed with the CEO, I would be absolutely panicking. If I went to a startup, I expect to meet a CEO. And the big thing is that title can't scare you as a candidate, because if you see that title and you think, oh my goodness, it's a CEO, what am I going to do? It doesn't mean much. I mean, look, I can go out tomorrow and I have my company, but I can go out tomorrow and say, like, for an example, one of my hobbies, I keep coral reef tanks and I do 3D printing. If I wanted to go out and say, I'm going to start a company, I could literally tomorrow say, I'm the CEO of Mythos Reef Labs. And
100%.
does that make me any different? Does that mean I'm somebody that's going to be scary now when I interview somebody? No. And I will say also in the DSO space, that was always a problem I had, was the stigma that comes with the title. So if you're interviewing in a startup part of the dental industry, do not let that title that you're interviewing with become stigmatized.
I really love that, because I never thought about that. I guess as a hygienist perspective, people have always told me, oh my gosh, you're cleaning the owner's teeth. I'm like, well, it's just another human being. Like, it doesn't really, never bothered me, but it's different perspectives. Some people may be bothered by it and scared, and some others may not. So I love that. How about, from your experience, what has been really good interviews or like not so great interviews that we can probably like learn from?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, really, at the end of the day, when you're thinking about interviews, a couple things. First, you always want to answer with what's called a SMART answer. So it's got to be specific, measurable, attainable, reasonable, and time bound. And what that means is you want to make sure you're giving a before, a middle, and an after. And so you have to always double check. And when you're giving stories, always give a real example. Don't give hypotheticals. If they ask for a hypothetical, bring it back to a real example, because whenever somebody's asking you a hypothetical question, you're going to give a hypothetical answer. And they're going to always be skeptical about it, because they're going to think, is he saying or is she saying what the real answer is or what they think I want to hear? So if you're giving a specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound example of something that you did, there's also another way that you call it. It's called STAR, which is situation, task. So what was the situation? What task do you have to do? What was the action you had to do to achieve it? And then what was the result afterwards? That's another way you always going to give those examples. But give real-life examples, and all of a sudden you go from hypothetical to credible. I think that's a really big thing. For me, as an interviewer, I laugh because I've been told before that sometimes people aren't sure if I'm interviewing them or if I'm their psychotherapist. But there's a reason for it, okay? It's because at the end of the day, I was always the kind of person that I was going to ask questions that were really meant and designed to throw my candidate off. And the reason being is because I never wanted to see what somebody prepared for. I wanted to see how somebody handled the curveballs, right? So for an example, and that was always, and what I was looking for wasn't even necessarily the answer. So I'll give you a couple examples. One of them I used to love, I'm sure everyone's heard of the question in an interview, and be prepared for this one always. What is your biggest strength and your biggest weakness, right? How classic is that one? Everyone expects it.
Yeah.
What I used to ask was, give me your two biggest strengths and your two biggest opportunities for improvement. And the difference is everybody comes prepared with one. They never come with two. So the first one is always,
You're evil. You're so evil.
But that was it, right? So I never cared about the first answer of either. All I cared about was the second, because the second was the one that they really had to think about and either be hypercritical or really start thinking. And that was usually the one that had the truth behind it versus the prepared one that they had canned up and ready to go, like, oh, I try too hard, or, oh, I'm a perfectionist. Like, no, sorry. And I wouldn't accept those either. If I got those questions, I would say, that's not a real answer. Try again. And I sometimes made people answer me 4 or 5 times until they got to an answer that I was satisfied with.
Oh my God.
I really would. But those were weird things.
Of you. Or maybe it was that long ago.
I don't know, but that was always with me. And then like another one that I used to love asking was, I said, okay, let's role play for a second. So we're on an airplane and you just took off, and the person next to you, they're clutching their armrests, their knuckles are turning white, they're sweating, they're shaking, they're obviously having a panic attack. I did have to add that last part on because somebody thought it was a heart attack once, and I had to change the entire question. So they're obviously having a panic attack. What do you do? And here's the thing. I do not care what the answer is to that question, except for one thing I never wanted to hear. If you answered everything else perfectly, and your answer to that question was, I would call the flight attendant, you were done. I was not going to interview you. I was not going to hire you. That was the end of the conversation. What I cared about was whatever the answer was, I would then double click and say, so why did you pick those specific actions to help them calm down? And what I was looking for is some response along the lines of, that's what I would want somebody to do if I was in that situation. So for me, that entire question was asking for empathy and seeing like, is this an empathetic person who truly cares in the moment, in a moment of panic? And of course, they're kind of panicking internally at that question too, because they're not ready for it. And they have no idea what to expect, what I'm looking for.
Random.
But it really didn't matter. I've heard all sorts of things. I've heard patting on the back. I've heard getting water for them. I've heard holding their hand. I mean, some of these may be nowadays leading to a lawsuit, but at the end of the day, you know, like there are things that I really think were great solutions, but the key was if it was something they would want to do for themselves. So be prepared. And especially like going back to our original question for startups, a lot of these CEOs, number one, they don't know how to interview because this is their startup and they're learning how to do it themselves.
Yes, 100%. They're still
But
figuring
number
it
two,
out.
yeah, they are. And they're going to probably ask you questions that are not appropriate and they're not necessarily meant to be the way that they sound. I've been victim of that a couple times too, and I felt really badly about it. Glad to know there's no HR to get back at me anymore. But at the end of the day, the idea is that just be yourself. I mean, that's the most important thing. If you're passionate about something and you truly believe in the mission behind it, do your research. Oh, I got another tip as well I'll throw in there as far as startup and DSO. Any interview you do, don't use AI. I feel like that's the quickest, easiest thing.
Second person who has said that, and to me, it's kind of unreal because people are like, "Oh, she must use AI for everything." Yes, I use AI a lot, but there's a lot of stuff that I still do on my own because you can't trust everything. Do everything, and you still have to double check it, read everything. It has to sound like you. I don't know.
Exactly. And I mean, and the more you use it, like I'm a heavy AI user, obviously, as well, since, you know, both of us are very involved in the AI fields. So I would say that, you know, the AI that I use, both AIs that I use know me pretty well. And I've trained it really well that when I tell it to generate something, it does sound like my voice. I've coded it specifically to avoid any AI tells. I've made sure I tell it, you know, here's what to look for. Every time I'm submitting something, I say, now review this again as if you were checking it if AI wrote it. And if you say yes to anything, start again. So I'm very careful about it. But even with that, so for an example, I have a client that I developed a training class for all of their doctors, the 6-office group. And the class was 2 hours long. And I designed the entire course with AI. It took me 12 hours to make that course. Would it actually take me probably less time if I just started from scratch and did it myself? Probably. But you know what? I know the content was solid. I know it looked very professional and it really had all the touches and the polish that I wanted it to have. But once I built the initial framework, I went through slide by slide and checked every line and went back and forth with it and kept double checking and fine tuning and making sure it was exactly how I wanted it to be. People use AI nowadays so quickly to just do everything that it ends up giving a lot of bad information. And sometimes it portrays you in a way that's not who you are. Or, you know, you're trying to put something in like, what I use AI for is like if I'm doing an interview with somebody, I might say, hey, give me a brief on this person, research them online, tell me about who they are, and then I can review it and I can use that in my interview. But that's something that I think that's an efficient way. Like it's called prompt engineering. If you're going to use it, find a way to use it where it's not going to be who you are, but it can help augment what you're presenting to somebody.
I love that. Last question. I know you may not be hiring now, but when you are, where can they find you? Where are you going to post it? Or is it going to be word of mouth? How is that going to look like for anybody who's
So for my organization, because it's AI augmented and I do use real world operators to supplement, once we get to the point where we are growing, we're in a growth stage right now. But as we start getting bigger client bases, for us, we're looking for consultants that would be coming in and potentially be operations experts with the AI being the feature forward part of the platform, and we use real people behind it to come in potentially up to once a quarter and be on monthly or biweekly phone calls with our clients as well to augment our AI with human assistance.
Yeah.
But each person can handle up to about 25 to 30 locations before we have to hire somebody else. So when you're looking for us, dentalmasterdynamics.com. You can find me also on Facebook. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me directly if you ever want any tips. I also, if you're ever looking for any tips and tricks just in the field, on my website, there's a blog. And literally every week, I write a new post. And most of my posts, if it's about operations and how to drive dentistry, that actually goes into my AI, and it helps continue to train my AI. So as I'm releasing new articles, it's training my AI, but it's also public knowledge because I want to be able to help practices wherever I can in any way I can, even if it's not going to be hiring me. So if it's something that you want to join, you can always look at me there, and probably, hopefully, within the next few months, we'll be looking for people as well.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I know I've always looked for help, and I've always contacted you, even when you weren't my direct manager. So, and I appreciate like your friendship as well. But I'm going to have all of your information in the bottom, his website, everything, so that you guys have all that in your hands. So thank you so much, Bryan. You're the best.
Absolutely. And I would throw out one more thing. If anybody's interested in supplemental income, I do also offer 15% referrals. So if anybody ever knows a dentist that they're interested in or something like that, they get in touch with me and we can talk about it. I can brief on the platform, and then residuals, as long as the person you refer is working with us, you get 15% of what they're paying us.
I love that. I really love that. So yes, definitely look at his website. I'll put everything below. Like and follow. Thank you.